so we'll get started. My name is Liam Cunningham. I'm the volunteer coordinator with Layers of London, and today we are lucky to have Sean Gubbins of Walk Hackney, who's worked with Friends of Hackney Archives to tell us a bit about the London Borough of Hackney's interesting history, and he's an expert in all different areas, so it should be fascinating and illuminating. So just to explain a bit how it works, so no one who's attending, your microphones or cameras won't be turned on at all. It'll just be Sean showing his presentation, and then at the end we'll have some time for some questions and answers. So at that point you'll be able to type your questions in the chat, and then Sean will be able to answer them. So if you're okay to get started now, Sean?
Yep.
I'll just stop sharing my screen and then you can start with your presentation.
Okay. Can I do that now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Liam?
Yep, over to you. Thank you.
All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is, as Liam says, is Sean Gubbins, and I've been intrigued in the history of Hackney, where I live, for the last 26 years or so. I research it and I write about it, and for the past 18 years, I've been sharing my knowledge and passion for Hackney's history by devising and leading history walks in various parts of Hackney. This afternoon, I've been asked to give you a short introduction to the history of Hackney and how it has been recorded on Layers of London. Now, for anyone listening who does not know Hackney, it is to be found in the northeast of London. It's an inner city borough bordering the wealth and power of the City of London. Today's Hackney was formed in 1965 from the metropolitan boroughs, previously parishes of Stoke Newington in the north, Hackney in the centre, and Shoreditch in the south, bordering the City of London. Each of these three areas have a distinct history and remain distinct. Stoke Newington was the furthest from London and was the most isolated. And in a way, I think it still retains some of its seclusion. To get to the centre of Stoke Newington, you have to either walk, cycle, go by bus or by car. There's no rail or tube line that runs through Stoke Newington that takes you right to the centre of it. Old St Mary's Church, with its graveyard surviving around it, gives the place still a rural English country village feel to it. And the church, which I show you a picture of, was rebuilt in 1563 of an original building, which probably has origins going back before the Norman Conquest in 1066. And probably was the only church when it was rebuilt in 1563, which is built in London between the time of the Reformation and the great church building programme of Christopher Wren after the Great Fire of London in 1666. It's a quite rare Elizabethan church. Now, Shoreditch, on the other hand, which grew up just outside the city walls, and it was one of London's first suburbs. And when Shoreditch's church was rebuilt in 1740 by George Dance the Elder, you can see from this map that it was very much built in a built-up area. Between Stoke Newington and Shoreditch was Hackney, which is by far the largest of the three. It's 5 times each of the others. And it was made up with a number of communities: Clapton, Dalston, Kingsland, Homerton, Shacklewell, Grove Street in South Hackney, Hackney Wick, as well as the settlement which became the centre of Hackney, which grew up around this church, St Augustine's, which dates from the late 13th century. Now, St Augustine's Church Tower is owned by the council now of Hackney, but it's leased by the Hackney Historic Buildings Trust. And in normal times, the trust opens the tower on the last Sunday of every month, and you can climb to the top to admire the views over this part of Hackney. Hackney Historic Buildings Trust has rescued a number of derelict and at-risk buildings in Hackney, restored them, refurbished them, and found new uses for them, including the Tower of St. Augustine's and the Round Chapel. Now, the Round Chapel was built in Lower Clapton for Congregationalists in 1871. And of the 9 outstanding nonconformist buildings in London, 3 of them, including this one here, are to be found in Hackney. We also have in Hackney, helping us to preserve our heritage, the Hackney Society. And that was formed in 1967. It works to conserve and regenerate Hackney's built environment and public spaces. And some years ago, it produced an online catalogue of over 400 locally listed buildings. We have in Hackney the award-winning Hackney Museum, and that offers permanent and changing temporary exhibitions. Its oldest exhibit is a 200,000-year-old Paleolithic flint, which was found near Stoke Newington Common in the 19th century, and is evidence of humans' first presence in these parts. The museum also exhibits the original and replica of a 10th century Saxon boat, which was found in Upper Clapton at the bottom of Springfield Park, beside the River Lee. That is London's second largest river and forms Hackney's eastern boundary. Hackney is also fortunate to have a still flourishing and well-respected archives at Dalston CLR James Library. This was formed in 1965 with archival material collected down the centuries in Stoke Newington, Shoreditch, and Hackney. And associated with the archives are the Friends of Hackney Archives, which are set up to promote the use of the archives and the study of Hackney's history. And it costs £15 to become a member of the Friends, which I hope you'd like to do if you're not already. And for that 15 quid, you receive, as well as opportunities to attend events, a newsletter, which is called The Terrier, which comes out 3 times a year, and also a award-winning journal called the Hackney History. The Terrier is now in its 106th edition, and Hackney History is about to publish volume 21. Now, you may have noticed that I have been illustrating my presentation so far with records from Layers of London. And those records were amongst 300 plus, which a team of 6 of us put on the Layers of London website. Now, all 6 of us were friends of Hackney Archives. And in August 2018, one of our number, Wendy Forrest, heard about the Layers of London project at the London Historians Workshop. And she proposed to the rest of the friends that we get involved with this project. So over 11 months, we met regularly, and we went through 35 years of the Terrier newsletter, and we picked out the most interesting article. And between us, we produced a brief synopsis of each article. And we did the same for the Hackney History Journal. Meanwhile, over at Layers of London, they digitized 96 of the Terriers, which the archive still had copies of, as well as all the Hackney History Journals. Now, I don't know how much all that cost, but the friends agreed to make a contribution from our own funds. And once that work was complete over at Layers of London, then our chairman, Robert Whitehead, uploaded each of these digitized newsletters and journals onto the Friends website, hackneyhistory.org. When all was ready, we uploaded onto the Layers of London all our 300 plus synopses, our records, which we had prepared. Now, each of those records has a link. You click on that link and you get taken to a site where you can find the fuller article in the Terrier or the Hackney History Journal. And you can then download them onto your own computer and read them at your own leisure. So that's how we in Friends of Hackney Archives got this information onto Layers of London. But back to the history of Hackney itself. Although the three parts that made up modern Hackney each have their distinct histories, I like to find themes that run through the history of each of them. And I'm going to try and bring out 3 or 4 of them for you this afternoon. Now, one reason that many of us like living in Hackney is because it's mixed in every way you can think of, age-wise, ethnically, financially, professionally. Hackney has a long history of accommodating anyone and everyone and accepting immigrants. It's been doing that for 350 years. And the first immigrants to actually come to this area were Jews. Now today, Hackney is known to be the home for many Hasidic Jews in Stamford Hill, but that's a far more recent community, which is built up over the last 50 years or so. When Jews were allowed back into England in the 1650s, after being expelled from this country in 1290, many settled in Hackney, in Clapton, in Homerton, and London Fields. In 1710, the Stoke Newington parish built houses on the west of Stoke Newington High Street for 4 religious refugee families from the Palatine area of Germany. In 1845, the German hospital was opened in Dalston for all London's poor Germans and others speaking the German language without distinction of religion or origin. And that hospital was staffed by German nurses until war broke out in 1939. In the 1980s, Hackney Council was one of the few councils that visited camps of Vietnamese boat people, offering them accommodations for them to settle here in Hackney. And there you see a picture of the community center for refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which is set up in 1984 in Wiston Road in Haggerston. Radicalism. 1500s and the 1600s were turbulent times in the history of this country and also a history of London. Religious, social, and economic change led to civil war and the establishment of the English Republic. But when things settled down after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, many continued to resist the established order, especially the Church of England. And many of these dissenters or nonconformists settled in this area, particularly around Newington Green in Stoke Newington. It was secluded, but not too far from London. And there, they created their own schools and chapels, including this chapel here you see on the screen, the Unitarian Chapel, first built in 1708. Again, it's one of those 3 nonconformist churches of interest in London, which can be found in Hackney. And it is London's oldest place of continuous nonconformist worship. When his home and laboratory were burnt down by a reactionary mob in Birmingham in 1791, scientist and radical Joseph Priestley fled to Hackney, where for a time he preached in this chapel and he taught at the Hackney New College in Homerton, which was spied upon by government at that time for being a hotbed of sedition. Many Quakers settled in Stoke Newington, and they campaigned for social reform, for the abolition of slavery, for prison reform, for women's education. William Wilberforce came to Stoke Newington to meet with fellow abolitionists, and he wanted to be buried here because his sister had married here, lived here, and was buried in this tomb here in Stoke Newington. Mary Wollstonecraft, as a girl, lived in Hoxton Square, where there was a Dissenters Academy, which was where her future husband, William Godwin, was educated. And she later lived and ran a girls' school at Newington Green, where there are plans to put up a statue to her. Another theme I bring out for you is horticulture. And for most of their past, Stoke Newington, Hackney and Hoxton and Haggerston in North Shoreditch were made up of open land. And mostly local people would have earned a living labouring on this fertile land, growing potatoes or onions or barley, rye and grass for hay. In the 1600s, Hackney was known for its tasty small turnips. In the 1700s, fertile land was used for plant nurseries, and there were a number in Hoxton. One was run by Thomas Fairchild. In 1717, he was the first person to scientifically produce an artificial hybrid, a cross between a Sweet William and a Carnation Pink, and which came to be known as Fairchild's Mule. But to make amends for tinkering with God's creation by producing such a hybrid, he left money in his will for an annual sermon to be preached at Shoreditch Church, St. Leonard's, which came to be known as the Vegetable Sermon. Just south of the centre of Hackney in 1771, a German immigrant called Joachim Conrad Lodges began a business, and that grew into the Hackney Botanical Nursery Gardens, with the largest arboretum in the world and the largest hothouse in the world, with 120 different types of palm. And it was to be found just off Mare Street, near St. Thomas's Square. The business introduced to England rhubarb, rhododendrons, dahlias, and they supplied, amongst others, Kew, St. James's Park, and Kensington Gardens. Stoke Newington also has a horticultural past. One plant nursery there was run by Mr. Robert Albridge, the master of the fuchsia, and it was close by the home of Shirley Hibbard, who was a prolific gardening writer of the late 19th century. And one time, he was president of the thriving Stoke Newington Chrysanthemum Society, which met at the Rochester Castle pub on Stoke Newington High Street for almost 50 years in the second half of the 19th century. Now, the only time that this area has been posh, and here I refer particularly to Hackney, was in the 16th century, when various nobles and courtiers had houses here. Unfortunately, the largest house, dating from medieval times, Brooke House, does not survive. It's where Henry VIII was reconciled to his daughter Mary in 1536. And for 200 years, it was an asylum looking after the mentally ill until the outbreak of the Second World War. Though bombed, it could have been restored, but it wasn't. And it was sadly pulled down in the 1950s. But Sutton House does remain. Not quite as old as Brooke House, it was built in 1535 by Ralph Sadler. He was brought up as a protege of Thomas Cromwell, and he survived his master to serve in the governments of Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Elizabeth I. From the 17th to the early 19th century, wealthy merchants built houses amongst the open land still to be found here in Hackney and Stoke Newington, less so in Shoreditch. And when they moved away, many of their houses became schools or institutions to look after orphans, prostitutes rescued from the streets, or the mentally ill. With the coming, though, of the first railway across Hackney in 1850, there was an impetus to build and turn the open fields into housing. Any richer folk still around quickly moved out, and terrace housing filled the space, providing homes for skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and traders, small clerks rather than middle-class solicitors and bankers who were found further west. Charles Booth noted in his writing at the end of the 19th century that Dawson's houses are rather better than the people. And if you look at Charles Booth's map of Hackney, Stoke Newington and Shoreditch, you can see no areas of wealth, no yellow. The little yellow that there is in the north and the top left corner is actually across the border from Stoke Newington in Islington, in Highbury. And as you go further south on the map, you'll see it gets darker in colour, showing greater poverty, closer to the city. But many people living here at that time also worked in local industry, which had been attracted to the area and remained here well into the 20th century. So if I had been growing up in Hackney in the middle of the last century, the matchbox toys I played with would have been made in Hackney. The paints and crayons I used would come from Reeves on Ashwin Street in Dalston. Some of my school reference books may have been printed by Iron Spottiswoode of Shacklewell. If I was lucky enough to have a camera, the celluloid film used in it was essentially a product first invented and manufactured by Parkesine and Ivorine at Homerton High Street. The piano my mum played might have come from Kemble and Company in Stoke Newington, and much of the furniture in my home might have been made in factories and workshops of Shoreditch or Hoxton. My bedroom wall might have been decorated with paint from Burgess in Homerton. Now, as you walk around Hackney, the surviving buildings bear witness to some of the past I have been telling you about. Perhaps the most eye-catching structure in today's Hackney, had it survived, would have been this. Turkish bath, right opposite Dalston Junction Station. How inviting it would have been as you got off your train after a hard day's work. Sadly, it only lasted 8 years until it burned down in 1890. But whenever I see a picture of it, I wonder how big the lockers must have been to take my great-grandmother's voluminous skirts. But there is still one surviving structure which gets a grasp from people on my Lower Clapton walk who see it for the first time. It's off Lower Clapton Road, and it's this. A bit of classical Greco-Hackney, you might say. Now, as I said at the beginning of the walk, the beginning of the talk, since 2002, I have been devising and leading Hackney history walks in different parts of Hackney. I've been offering 2 per month throughout the year, usually on a Saturday morning, in 20 different parts of Hackney. I now have walks, each last between 2 and 3 hours. I charge £10, £8 concession, and I also have carried out private walks at various organisations such as Friends of Jeffrey, Archives of Jeffrey Museum, Dalston, the Barbican Art Centre, and the Society of Genealogists and others. But these walks have had to stop with lockdown and social distancing rules. So I've been putting up snippets of my walks as routes to follow. I've been putting them up as threads on my Twitter account and then uploading them to my website. Each of them is about a mile long, and they actually just go down streets, not parks, to take some of the pressure off the parks at this time. And you can find 16 of them on my website, walkhackney.co.uk @lockdown walks. And gradually I'll be adding a few more as the weeks go along. But I suggest that the Layers of London is a great source for planning a history walk, giving you information about the buildings, the people, or the events from the past associated with an area you might choose to walk through. So how about developing or strolling down Ermine Street? Now, Ermine Street was a name given to a Roman road, which was built 2,000 years ago from London Bridge up through what is now the city, and then north of the city where we are, up to Yorkshire and beyond. And it goes through, as it leaves the city, Ermine Street goes through, it connects the three parishes, ancient parishes of Shoreditch, Hackney and Stoke Newington. Because Shoreditch High Street, Kingston Road, Kingston High Street, Stoke Newington Road, Stoke Newington High Street and Stamford Hill were all part of that old Roman road. The route from Shoreditch up to top of Stamford Hill is 4 miles. But I suggest if you want to walk it, you walk downhill from Stamford Hill. It will be an easier walk going downhill. And this is what you'll come across. You'll come across turnpikes. There were turnpikes and toll gates, 3 places on that route: up at Stamford Hill, down at the junction between Paul's Pond Road and Kingston High Street, and also by Shoreditch Church. There were grand houses up at Stamford Hill, perhaps the grandest part of 19th century Hackney, including the house of Henry Sarson, the vinegar merchant. His vinegar works were down by Earl Street. It was also home to some of the first Jews living in Hackney, Rothschilds, Montefiore's. And up there was a museum once of antiquities, Gothic Hall, owned by Mr. Windruss. Of course, coming down Stamford Hill, you pass the Abbey Park Cemetery and you'll cross the course of the Hackney Brook. Then there are a few grand 18th century houses on your right, one put up by a wealthy Quaker, which in the 19th century was a medical dispensary. There'll be lots of pubs once they're open to refresh yourself with on the way down. Some survived, others have long gone. One of them, Rochester Castle, was where the Stoke Newington Chrysanthemum Society met. You pass the site of the first Methodist church in Hackney, just over 200 years old, where the bookies' chorals began. Sadly, off Stoke Newington Road, you will see Coronation Avenue, which is the site of a bombing during the Blitz, and over 150 people lost their lives. Street markets, Ridley Road, Kingston Waste Market, theatres, clubs, churches, mosques, 2 train stations, fire station, and you'll also pass some of Hackney's oldest houses dating from 1758. You'll pass Metropolitan Hospital and also the site of the Lepers Hospital, which goes back to the 13th century. You'll cross the canal. You'll pass housing, which is stabling and forage stores for tram horses. And of course, down at the bottom of Kingston Road are the almshouses of the Jeffrey Museum. Next to it, Vietnamese restaurants. And also along the way, you'll pass furniture, shoe, clothing, tobacco factories. So 4 miles of history, 4 miles telling you the history of this area. And as you go down, just think of the people who have witnessed that road in 2,000 years. Ordinary people traveling up and down the road, transporting their goods, paying their tolls, subject to robbery maybe, or murder. Royal processions came down here. This is how James VI of Scotland entered London to take the throne of England as James I. Highwaymen could be found on Stamford Hill. And indeed, in 1746, the returning English army were welcomed by a peal of bells at Shoreditch Church as they returned from having defeated the Scots at Culloden. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll end there. And just to remind you, I do offer walks. And once lockdown is finished, I hope you can join me on summer. We can discuss further the history of Hackney. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was really interesting. I think you've painted quite a vivid picture of walking down those 4 miles. I live quite near to Kingsland Road myself, so I hope I can head out there and have a look myself in the next few days. We'll just, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat now, and I can facilitate and read them out to you, Sean.
Okay.
I just have one question myself that came to mind. I read before that when London was reorganized in the 60s and they put all the different areas into boroughs, that some areas weren't too keen to be associated with their neighbours. I was wondering, was there any controversy about Stoke Newington and Shoreditch and Hackney all being lumped into one?
Yes, there was, and it was suggested by I think Shoreditch and Stoke Newington that the new borough be called Kingsland, but Hackney wouldn't have it. So.
How did they get their name on the borough?
Hackney, well, they were the largest.
Okay.
But yeah, there was a bit of disquiet about what the new borough was going to be called.
So we have some questions in, I think. Tara asks, I live in southeast London. Do you have any actual walking routes on your website that I could download to follow?
I'm sorry, I'm very parochial. I keep to Hackney, but I'm sure there are on the internet. If you look around, I'm sure there
are. Claire asks, where are the oldest houses that you mentioned on the walk?
They are basically, if you know Hackney, if you know Kingsland Road, there's a market called the Kingsland Waste. So they are between Middleton Road and Richmond Road. They are set back. If you walk north, they're basically on your right-hand side, and they don't look very old, but some of them are. And there's a very good article which is can be found in one of the volumes of Hackney history, written by an academic about those houses.
And I think I misunderstood Tara. She didn't want walks for southeast London, she meant for Hackney. So yeah, if you go to Sean's website, is it walkhackney.?
Yeah, .co.uk.
.co.uk, then he has some walking routes there. Alison asks, can you say some more about why few main railway lines in Hackney, especially in Stoke Newington? Why there are so few?
I don't know the answer to that, but it just happens that no railway lines were actually built across Stoke Newington. The first railway line that came to Hackney was in 1850, and it basically went through Hackney, joining the main railway terminuses in north of the centre of London to the docks in East London. So it came through London, it came through Hackney. Then 15 years later, the railway line decided to build a branch line down to Broad Street in the city. And then in 1872, a railway line was built from Liverpool Street up to going due north, and it actually just skirted around the side of Stoke Newington. And you might say, but there's a station called Stoke Newington Station. Well, there is, but when it was built, Stoke Newington and Hackney were separate parishes, and in fact was built in the parish of Hackney. It wasn't built in Stoke Newington. So it just is a thing of history that there is no railway line that actually goes directly through Stoke Newington, nor is there a tube line. Manor House, I think 2 or 3 of its entrances might actually be in Stoke Newington, but otherwise it was actually built on the border between Stoke Newington and Haringey, and this tube line doesn't actually go through Stoke Newington.
I read before that there's no tube line because the land is too marshy. Is there anything in that, or?
I don't know. Who might have an answer is Amir Doughton. He has a very good website called History of Stokey, and And I think there have been proposals to put tube lines through and stations in Stoke Newington, but and I think he showed maps of that, but they never came to be.
Another question: are there any books that you would recommend for researching the history of Hackney?
Yes, on my website you'll find a list of the books which I have used for my research. There's a lot on the internet as well. There's a volume called the Victoria County History, and that was first published at the end of Queen Victoria's reign, county by county, and the one on Middlesex, which includes Hackney, volume 10 of the that can now be found. That's been digitized by British History Online, BHO. So if you actually Google Victoria County History, or you look at the BHO website, then you will come across the history, the Victoria County history, the County of Middlesex, and one of the sections there is on Hackney. There's another section, another volume on Islington and Stoke Newington. There isn't one on Shoreditch, but they're full of information.
Christopher asks, does Hackney claim to have been the most nonconformist area of London, and does it have any rivals in this regard?
I don't know. I would imagine that I'm not even sure which parish or borough Clapham is in, but yes, and there may be other people who are listening who could answer that question better than I.
Someone asked, when I was at school in Hackney, we would do a lot of local history. Do you think this should be reintroduced to the curriculum?
Absolutely.
Philip asks, was the Regent's Canal significant? I see on maps that it had massive gasworks on the southern side.
Yes, it was. I mean, got to remember when it was built, and this is the 200th anniversary of it. And sadly, because of lockdown, many of the celebrations to mark that have had to be cancelled or postponed. There was a lot being planned for this summer. But when the canal was completed, it took 8 years to complete. It was completed in 1820. Of course, it came through fields, open fields. But very soon afterwards, beginning of the 1820s, gas companies came, and there were two which were built on the south side of the canal. One was built where Hagson Park is now, and the northern side of part of Hagson Park was actually developed from the gasworks which had been there, and then further down the canal, where Bridge Academy is now, Bridge Academy School, that also was a gasworks. And of course, they would receive the coal for making the gas by canal, and you can still see the evidence of the cut in Hagson Park, where the barges would come down the canal, and then they would be manoeuvred down the cut into the gasworks, which is now the park, and you can still see the sort of the footprint, so to speak, of that cut which brought the barges into that area.
Okay, so maybe just one or two more questions, because it's almost 22. Sue asks, do you know anything of Haledon Street in Hackney? I think it was destroyed in the 70s. The Hackney archives only had a couple of photos.
How do you spell that?
Halidon.
And where is that?
She doesn't say.
Okay. I don't know, but okay. if she emails me get my email from the website, I could see I could see if I can find an answer.
And Zara asks, given the nature of the makeup of Hackney, over the years with migration? I am thinking in particular Jewish and Turkish migrants and the rag trade. Does there remain a trace of the rag trades that these communities may have been involved in alongside the industries you mentioned?
I'm sure around about Hackney there are workshops and involved in clothing, which may be continuations of workshops which existed 50, 60 years ago. But by the 1980s, the clothing industry, which very much dominated parts of Hackney and Stoke Newington, had diminished. But there are traces of it. If you go to Stoke Newington Road, you can see I think it's Retro, the building there. That was actually built as a clothing factory by Simpsons in 1929, and that for a time employed 2,000 people. If you go to Chatham Place, you can still see the outlet shop of the I can't remember the shop now, but that's the outlet shop of the factory there, and that has always been a clothing factory. And then if you walk up there, as I did up the other day, you can still see adverts for people, for seamstresses or people working in the clothing industry. So the clothing industry has always had an association with the centre of Hackney and parts of Stoke Newington. And though we're very much diminished by the 1980s, there's still traces of it to be found.
All right, well, I think that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Sorry if your questions we didn't get to your questions, but I'm sure if you have a look on Sean's website and on Layers of London, you can learn everything you would ever need to know about Hackney. So I just want to say thank you very much, Sean, for giving your presentation. It was really interesting, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And a recording of it will be available on our website. So look out for that in the next few days. And we have lots of people in the chat saying thank you very much, Sean. Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
All right, so thanks everyone, and hope everyone has a nice afternoon and evening. And thanks again.
Bye-bye. See ya.
Bye.
Okay, I'll leave it.
All right, thanks, John.
Okay, I'll see you around.
See you again. Bye.
Goodbye.